In the year 2011, my wife and I decided to rent a cabin for a weekend. We found a place on Airbnb that seemed pretty good. It was in a more remote spot, and it was right on a lake. The price was high, so that was pretty much what we expected. The pictures looked nice, and the reviews were positive, so we didn't mind paying a little more. We arrived on Friday afternoon, at around 3 p.m. The drive had taken a little longer than expected, because the last few miles were on a rough, winding dirt road, and my car was not the best on that kind of road. The cabin itself was small but well kept, and there was a lot of space outside. We couldn't even see another place from the front or back. The owner had left a note welcoming us, and he also left a list of nearby trails and fishing spots. The nearest town was about 30 minutes away, but we had brought enough supplies to last us the weekend, and we weren't planning to leave. After unpacking, we spent the rest of the day sitting at the lake. As the sun started to set, it began to get cold, so we headed back to the cabin, made dinner, and relaxed inside. By 10, we were both exhausted and decided to call it a night. At around midnight, I woke up to a knocking sound on the front door. At first I thought I had imagined it, but then it happened again, and my wife woke up too. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. "Yeah," I said. I got up as quietly as I could and grabbed the flashlight from my backpack, but I didn't turn it on. Just then, the knocking turned into loud pounding. Someone was at the door, and they weren't being subtle about it. My wife sat up, looking nervous. I crept toward the kitchen window, which had a clear view of the porch. Then I pulled back the curtain slightly and saw a man standing with his back to me. He looked young, maybe early 20s, but he was huge, at least 6'2", and built like an athlete. He wore a dark hoodie and jeans, and he kept pounding on the door with his fist. I stayed still, hoping he would go away, but he stayed there and kept knocking. I thought about calling the cops, but we were in the middle of nowhere, and I wasn't sure how long it would take for them to get here. Then my wife grabbed my arm. "What do we do?" she whispered. We sat there waiting, as the knocking went on for another minute or two, and then suddenly it stopped. I let out a breath, thinking it was over, but then a loud thud came from the back of the cabin. Someone was hitting the back wall. My wife and I stayed as quiet as possible, avoiding the windows. The noise went on for a few minutes, then stopped again. We waited, but nothing else happened. Then after what felt like an eternity, we finally dared to move. I checked the windows, but the man was gone. We stayed up for a while, listening for any more sounds, but that was the end of it. Eventually, we went back to bed and tried to get some sleep. In the morning, I went outside to check around the cabin. The front door had smudges where the man's hands had been, and the back wall had a few scuff marks, like someone had been kicking it, and the plants near the porch were trampled. We debated whether we should leave, but it was broad daylight now, and we tried to convince ourselves that it was probably just some drunk guy who had wandered over by mistake, unlikely as that seems. I called the cabin owner to let him know what happened, and he sounded surprised, then offered to call the cops for us, but I told him it was okay. We figured it was a one-time thing. We spent the rest of the day walking along the trails, and sat by the fire pit in the evening. Everything felt normal, and we told ourselves it was just some random incident, nothing to worry about. That night, I was a little nervous before going to bed, but I always try to be a big tough guy in front of my wife, so I didn't show it. Anyway, I figured that if the guy from before had meant to break in, he would have done it last night. We'd been in bed for about an hour when the knocking started again. It was just like before, and it eventually turned into loud pounding. My wife and I got up right away. I turned on the porch light, hoping it would scare him off, but it didn't. He just kept hitting the door, like he didn't care if we knew he was there. I didn't bother looking out the window this time, because I knew exactly who it was. Then, just like the night before, the pounding stopped. A few seconds later, we heard it on the back wall again. At some point, it stopped again, and we managed to get to sleep. But then at around 3 in the morning, I woke up to a strange glow coming from outside. I got up and looked out the window, and our car was on fire. We called 911, but the fire was already out of control. The flames had engulfed the entire front half of the car, and there was nothing we could do except watch. My wife was panicking, but I kept cool, and I was being really tough and strong like always. We waited for over an hour before the cops got there, and they stayed until morning. The owner showed up right around sunrise and talked to the cops as well. After a while, he eventually admitted that it was probably his son who did it. He had been angry that they were renting out the cabin, but this was the first time he had ever done anything to a guest. He was picked up that day, and we were able to confirm that it was him. The owner ended up paying for our car, and we agreed not to sue, but his son did some time in prison for what he did. In my expert opinion, he deserves it. When I was 12, I went on a summer camping trip with my scout group. It was a 4-day trek through the woods, and I was excited. We had all packed our gear as we were told, and our scout leaders went over the safety rules before we set out. The first day was an easy hike, just a few miles to get us warmed up for the harder trails ahead. The weather was clear, and the group was in good spirits. We stopped in the late afternoon to set up camp near a small stream that was on the map. The older scouts helped the younger ones pitch their tents, and by the time we were done, the sun was starting to set. After eating, a few of us went to fetch more water from the stream, which was about a 10-minute walk. There were 5 of us, all around the same age, and we were carrying empty canteens and a couple of buckets. The path to the stream wasn't far, but it wound through a thick section of the forest, and there was barely a trail to follow. It was getting dark fast, and we hurried so we wouldn't be stuck out there in the woods alone for too long. As we filled our canteens, we talked about random stuff, mostly just about what we would do the next day. Then we headed over to our campsite. On the way back, we noticed something on the trail. There was a broken tree lying across the path. The break looked fresh, with splintered wood still exposed, and no signs of rotting. That wasn't what bothered us, though. What bothered us was the way it had been cut. It wasn't a natural break that could happen from the wind. The cut was clean, like it had been done with something sharp, like a machete or an axe. We knew that none of us had brought anything like that, so it couldn't have been any one of us. Our scout leaders only carried small hatchets for firewood, and they weren't strong enough to take down a tree that size. That meant someone else had to be out here. We stood around the broken tree, staring at it and then looking around the darkening forest. There was no sign of anyone nearby, and no sound other than the usual noises of the forest. Even though we didn't see or hear anything unusual, the idea that a stranger had been out here, cutting down trees for some unknown reason, made us uneasy. We hurried back to camp and told the others. The leaders didn't seem too concerned. "It's probably nothing," one of them said. "Maybe a hiker or a ranger clearing the trail." But they agreed to check it out in the morning. Some of the older boys were more interested, though. 2 of them, Mark and Jake, decided to go and investigate on their own. They were both around 16 and thought they were braver than the rest of us. "Stay here," Mark said. "We'll go see if there's anything weird." The rest of us sat in silence around the fire, watching as their flashlights disappeared into the woods. Nobody talked much while they were gone, and it felt like forever before they finally came back. When they did, they looked shaken. "There's more," Jake said. "It's not just the one tree. There's a whole path of them, all cut the same way, and at the end of it, one of them was covered in blood." That sent a chill through the group. "Animal blood?" one of the leaders asked. "I don't know," Mark said. "Maybe, but there was a lot of it." I thought they might be messing with us, but we started to panic anyway. If there was someone out here, then we didn't know what he might do to us. Some of us wanted to leave, but the leaders insisted we stay until morning because it was too dark to get out. Mark and Jake decided to check one more time before we all turned in. This time they came back with a story that was even stranger. "We found someone," Mark said. "He said he was a hunter." "What?" one of the leaders asked. "Did you talk to him?" "Yeah," Jake said. "We asked if he was cutting down the trees, but he said no. He didn't seem surprised about them, though. He just told us we should go back to our camp and stay there. That didn't make anyone feel better." Some of us whispered about whether we should pack up and leave that night, but the leaders told us we weren't going anywhere in the dark. They reassured us that nothing was wrong, but none of us really believed them. That night, nobody felt comfortable. We sat around the fire for a long time, talking quietly. Occasionally, someone would turn toward the trees, convinced they heard something. Then eventually, one of the leaders told us all to go to bed. I lay in my tent, trying to sleep, but I couldn't. Every time I closed my eyes, I thought I heard something moving outside. Then, sometime late at night, I was sure that I heard something. I thought it was just someone from our group, but I decided to peek outside anyway. As soon as I looked out, I saw that there was a man standing by the fire pit. The fire had burned down to just embers, and he was poking at them with a stick. He was a big man, taller than any of the leaders, but I couldn't see his face. I knew immediately that he wasn't one of us. I stayed completely still, barely breathing because I was scared to make a noise. He didn't look around and didn't seem to notice me. He just stood there, poking the embers for a while. Then he turned and walked away, disappearing into the trees. I didn't sleep after that, and when the sun came up, I told everyone what I had seen, but nobody believed me. They said it must have been one of the leaders, checking the fire, but I knew it wasn't. I had seen him clearly enough to know he wasn't anyone from our camp. We packed up and left that morning, and the leaders acted like everything was normal, but I knew they were creeped out too. I kept looking over my shoulder as we hiked out, half expecting to see that man watching us. I don't know who he was, or why he was out there. All I know is that I never went back to that part of the woods again. A few years ago, I was a student at a technical college. I've graduated, but after my second year, I got a summer co-op position at a hydroelectric power station. The pay was crap, but it was pretty good experience for what I wanted to do, and that did pay off eventually. The plant was near a small town that pretty much existed only for the workers and their families. It was in the middle of nowhere, and it was miles away from any real civilization. There wasn't much to do, but I didn't care that much. I spent most of my time working, and when I was off, I was usually too tired to care. Housing options were limited, but I managed to find a decent place. An older woman named Mrs. Fletcher rented out her basement to workers and students like me. It was fully furnished, with a small kitchen, a bathroom, and enough space to be comfortable. It was much better than some of the rundown motels where other temporary workers had to stay. Mrs. Fletcher was nice, but mostly kept to herself, which was fine by me. One weekend in July, I decided to drive home to visit my family. It was a 3-hour drive, and I left Friday evening. I spent the weekend catching up with my parents and some friends. By Sunday evening, I had to head back for another week of work. I ended up leaving way later than I should have, and it was 9 p.m. by the time I got onto the road. That meant that I'd be back by midnight if all went well. The drive started off fine. The first hour was just highway, but once I got closer to the plant, the roads became more isolated. It was paved the whole way, but there was less traffic, and it went down to a single lane. The last stretch was a long dark highway with barely any lighting, and there weren't many other cars out at that hour. At one point, I started to feel tired, so I turned up the radio to keep myself awake. When I was about 20 minutes from town, my car started struggling. It was an older Toyota Yaris, but it had always been reliable. At first I thought it was fine, but then the engine stuttered hard, and the car lost power, but I managed to steer it to the side of the road before it completely died. I tried the ignition a few times, but it was no use. The engine wouldn't turn over. Luckily, I still had cell service, so I grabbed my phone and called roadside assistance. They told me it would be at least an hour before someone could get to me, since I was so far out. It wasn't the best situation to be in, but there wasn't much I could do, so I turned on my hazard lights and tried to keep myself awake while I waited. At first, I just sat there, scrolling through my phone and listening to music, but after about 20 minutes, I started feeling really tired. The weekend had been busy, and the drive was long, so I decided to just rest my eyes for a minute, but I must have fallen asleep. Then I woke up suddenly, and I was feeling groggy and disoriented. For a second, I wasn't sure why I had woken up, but then I heard a noise outside. Something was moving near my car. Then I heard the distinct sound of my back trunk handle being pulled. At first I thought it was the roadside assistance guy, but then I realized that it couldn't be. Why would they try to open my door instead of knocking on my window or calling me? I turned around and looked out the back window. There was a man standing there, but he wasn't wearing a uniform as far as I could tell. It was dark though, so I wasn't that sure. I cracked my window slightly and asked, "Who are you?"
I got lost in the woods. Could I get a ride?
He asked. Something felt off. He didn't look lost, and he wasn't dirty or tired looking. He looked completely fine. I glanced in my rearview mirror, trying to see if there was a car parked behind me, but I couldn't see anything since it was too dark. "I can't help you," I said. "I'm waiting for roadside assistance." He stood there for a moment, then tried the door handle again.
Just let me in. I need help.
"No, I'm not opening the door." We sat there for a few seconds, neither of us saying anything. Then, without warning, he pulled a tire iron from his jacket and swung it at my window. The glass shattered instantly, but the window stayed in place. Then after a few more hits, it finally caved in. He reached through the broken window, trying to unlock the door, and I fumbled to grab my phone, but my hands were shaking. I tried to push him back, but he was already halfway in. Then, out of nowhere, bright headlights were coming down the road, and a vehicle was approaching fast. The man stopped for a split second before pulling back. He glanced toward the headlights, then turned and ran into the woods without saying a word. I sat there, breathing hard, as the truck pulled up behind me, and this time, it was the roadside assistance guy. He got out and walked over, looking confused. What the hell happened here? I was still shaken, but I managed to explain it. He looked towards the woods, but the man was already gone. He offered to call the police, but I knew it wouldn't do much good. There was no way they'd find him in the dark. The roadside guy helped get my car going, and I followed him back into town. When I got home, I didn't sleep much that night. I told Mrs. Fletcher what happened the next day, and she was surprised, but not shocked. She said strange things had happened in the area before. Some people thought drifters passed through, taking advantage of how remote the area was. Others thought it was just local thugs trying to rob people. I never found out who the man was or what he wanted. Maybe he really was lost, but I don't believe that. I think he was looking for an easy target, and if the roadside guy had shown up just a minute later, I don't know what would have happened. When I was in high school, my family lived on a large property in northern Ontario. It was really in the middle of nowhere, and the nearest town was a 45-minute drive away. There were only 2 other houses nearby, and they weren't even really that close. One belonged to an old woman named Janice, who lived alone, and the other belonged to a middle-aged man named Alan. My parents didn't like Alan, and they didn't try to hide it from me and my sister. He wasn't friendly, and there was something about him that put people off. He rarely spoke to us, and when he did, it was usually to complain about something. Even before this happened, my dad warned me not to go near his place, but I still don't know why he said that. One afternoon, there was a knock at our front door. My dad answered it, and I heard Alan's voice. He sounded shaken, which was unusual for him. I peeked through the window and saw him standing there, pacing on our front porch as he tried to talk to my father. My dad stepped out, and they talked for a few minutes before he came back inside. My mom asked what was going on, and he told us that Alan had discovered our elderly neighbor's body. He said she was dead when he found her. My dad seemed really confused, but I could tell that he was trying to keep it together for us. My mom looked horrified, and I remember her sitting down at the kitchen table, pressing her hands to her face. I asked how Alan had found her. My dad sighed and said that he told him he had a sudden urge to check on her. That didn't make sense because as far as we knew, they weren't close. He had never mentioned her before, and we had never seen them visit each other. It was also weird that he would come and tell us, since we weren't close with him either. He should have just called the police. We didn't trust Alan, and I could tell that my dad thought something wasn't right. It wasn't long before my mom called it in, and the police got there about an hour later. They went over to our neighbor's house and spoke with Alan first, while my dad and I stood on the porch watching. Eventually, an officer came over to speak with my dad. They talked for a few minutes before the officer walked away. We hadn't really seen anything anyway. The police spent the rest of the day there, going in and out of the old woman's house, and later a coroner's van showed up. It felt strange to think that she was dead inside her house the whole time, and no one had known. Alan didn't stick around for long. He walked back to his house and didn't come out again. That night, we locked our doors and windows, which we never usually did. For the next few weeks, things felt different. The old woman's house was dark and empty, and Alan was nowhere to be seen. My parents didn't talk about it much, but I could tell they were still thinking about it. There was something about the whole situation that didn't sit right with my dad. Looking back, I think he had a feeling there was more to the story than what Alan had said. We didn't see Alan at all for a while. No one did. His house seemed almost empty, and there was no sign of him going in or out. The police hadn't been around for a while, and we started to move on. It was sad that our neighbor was gone, but there didn't seem to be anything else to do. Life went back to normal, or at least it seemed like it had. Then one evening, my dad and I were sitting outside when he spotted Alan walking down the road towards his house. It was the first time we'd seen him since the police had come. He was carrying a bag of groceries, and he looked the same as always, expressionless and stiff. My dad watched him the whole way, not saying a word. When Alan disappeared into his house, my dad shook his head. "I don't like it," he muttered. Alan kept to himself as usual, but now that he was back, I couldn't help but feel unsettled. My dad still thought there was something off about the way he had found the old woman's body. It wasn't just that he hadn't called the police, it was that he had no real reason to be there in the first place. And now that he was back, we didn't know what to expect. A few days later, my mom heard from someone in town that the police had ruled the old woman's death natural. That should have been the end of it, but my dad wasn't convinced. One afternoon, I was outside when I saw Alan standing by the edge of his property, staring at our house. He wasn't doing anything, just watching, but when he noticed me looking, he turned and went back inside. I told my dad, but he didn't say much. Then, just as suddenly as he had come back, Alan disappeared again. His house was dark, and no one saw him around town. Weeks passed, and then one afternoon, I was coming home from school with my dad when we saw police cars surrounding Alan's house. My dad slowed the truck, and we could see officers going in and out. We parked at home, and my dad walked over to see what was going on. He came back a few minutes later. "They arrested Alan," he said. I didn't know what to say. We eventually found out that Alan had killed her for her money, and he tried to forge her will. We had lived next to a murderer and hadn't even known it. That night, my parents talked about how lucky we had been. If he was willing to kill her over money, what else was he capable of? It was a disturbing thought. A few weeks later, someone came and boarded up Alan's house. He never came back, and Janice's house stayed empty for a long time too. Eventually, someone new moved in, but by then, we had moved away. Even years later, I still think about it. I wonder if anyone who lives there now knows what happened. I wonder if they ever ask about the man who used to live there, the man who killed his neighbor and almost got away with it.